This episode of New Politics was released on the 14th of August, 2026, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Is AUKUS really about defending Australia, or is it surrendering control of our foreign policy? And what happens when America's military interests no longer match up to our own? AUKUS is turning out to be a big mistake. It's supporting a new wave of American imperialism, and future generations will be the ones paying the bill. I'm Eddie Djokovic.
I'm David Lewis. All of this is coming up in this big episode of New Politics.
And if you're listening in and haven't subscribed to our website at New Politics, you're missing out on half of what we do. There's regular articles and analysis of this strange world of politics. It's all free, and you can subscribe at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, if you do want to support us, it's just $5 per month at Patreon and Substack, and all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and a retired Army chief have slammed parliamentarians for not answering serious questions about the AUKUS deal. Speaking at a public inquiry today, Turnbull said the deal could leave us without any nuclear-powered submarines.
If the goal of this project is to acquire nuclear-powered submarines, every indication is that we won't get any. The Americans are not producing enough for their own navy, let alone ours. The British shipbuilding industry is in disarray.
The government was also criticised for letting American troops deploy at a Perth military base.
AUKUS is in the spotlight again, with an independent public inquiry being held at the moment. And at the inquiry, the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull said that AUKUS is a colossal mistake, and it's becoming more and more difficult to disagree with that and dismiss these concerns. Now, Malcolm Turnbull's been saying this for a long time, so have so many other people. So have we, David. I think it's been about 5 years that we've been railing against AUKUS and suggesting that it's a very, very bad deal. Now, Malcolm Turnbull, he's been looking at it from the perspective of the submarines, where there's hundreds of billions of dollars going into this deal over the next 30 or 40 years. And in the unlikely event that everything does fall into place, which never happens with these sort of things, but if it does happen, that includes extending the current Collins-class fleet for another 15, 20 years. Good luck with that. Also finding all the right training crews for the AUKUS program, building the nuclear infrastructure to support this program. And that would involve getting around the legislation that currently prohibits nuclear infrastructure in Australia. Also acquiring the Virginia-class submarines from the US, and then eventually building British-designed submarines in Adelaide at some point in the 2040s. And even if this all works out, which is very unlikely, even all of that's not going to be in Australia's favour. Now, the United States is actually struggling to build enough submarines for itself, and under US law, the President of the United States has to decide whether giving up any of those submarines that have been built in the United States is in the US military interests, even though Australia is the one that's going to be paying for all these submarines. So even though we'll be spending billions and billions of dollars expanding American military facilities, training our military personnel to fit all of this out, and completely reorganising our defence forces to fit around AUKUS and to fit around the United States, if the United States decides to keep these submarines, there's absolutely nothing that we can do about it. And so when you take all of these issues into account, and there's so many of these issues to take into account, it's no wonder that Malcolm Turnbull has said that AUKUS is a colossal mistake.
Yeah, any deal in which you pay to receive nothing. And it was clear. We said it, we weren't the only ones to say it, but we definitely said it, that there's not even a guarantee that we'll get any submarines. And with US military influence declining, and this is a long-term thing too. It's easy to point at Trump and say, oh yes, look at what he's done in Iran, look at what he did in Venezuela and all of that. And that's all true. But it was declining under Biden. It was declining under Obama. It's been declining since probably about Clinton, to be fair. Not necessarily too, because these presidents were bad at what they did. Some of it was American error, but a lot of it was a changing world. China's influence has grown. Europe's influence has grown. Countries in South America, which were always vital to American interests, have moved away from American influence. And so America finds itself looking at very old-fashioned, almost certainly pre-Vietnam War models of influence. Whether this is because the Trump administration has now put all the wrong people in and they can only think in terms of what was happening in their childhood and young adulthood, or even if it wasn't their childhood and young adulthood, an idealized version of what happened back then. And Trump has probably hastened the decline rather than started it. Let's be fair here. And whereas Biden and Obama, Clinton and both Bushes, or at least George W. Bush, tried to slow the decline and even reverse it, Trump hasn't. This leads us to AUKUS, in that Australia should be an independent South Asian country with our predominantly Anglo legal system and our multicultural culture, which we used to say was predominantly European, but things are changing there too. And that's not a bad thing. I'm not about to rail against changing demographics in Australia. Policies, including our foreign policy, should acknowledge this. This doesn't necessarily mean rejecting America altogether. Rejecting its current policy on AUKUS, yes, and rejecting its own foreign policy about war in Iraq and support of Israel, yes, sure. All of that. But it doesn't mean rejecting America altogether, but embracing America to the point where we're damaging our interests in other ways, I think is a mistake.
Oh, well, my feeling is that embracing America in the way that we probably could would involve saying, look, sorry, this is such a bad deal, we'll have to cancel the whole thing. That's what embracing America would actually mean, and embracing the UK as well on this issue, because at the moment, this whole AUKUS process has changed quite a lot over the past 5 years, and we're just filled with all this sort of different levels of misinformation and disinformation about this. And Australia is now preparing to buy 3 used American nuclear submarines. That was actually raised about 2 months ago, I think. That's when Richard Marles brought it up. But that all raises some pretty basic questions, like how old will they be? How much operational life will they have when we finally receive them? And what will happen at the end of their life, which could be pretty soon? Who pays to dismantle them, and where does all that radioactive waste go? None of these issues have been discussed. And then we've mainly been focusing on the US, but then there's the UK as well. Malcolm Turnbull said that its naval shipbuilding industry is in complete disarray, and I don't know if that's the case or not, but we just have to take Malcolm Turnbull at his word here. So there's a number of different factors here. Australia's future fleet, its submarine fleet anyway, depends on Britain delivering the SSN AUKUS style submarine from an industry that's in complete disarray, according to Malcolm Turnbull. It also depends on America lifting its own submarine production from 1 submarine to 2 submarines per year. It also depends on Adelaide creating an entirely new nuclear shipbuilding industry. Then on top of that, we've got the ageing Collins-class submarines that's got to be improved somehow so that it survives this transition. So all of these things just have to go right across 3 different countries over several decades, and has to take into account 4 or 5 different governments in each of those countries over that time, maybe even more. There could be a wide range of different prime ministers and different US presidents. And the other factor is that the geopolitical circumstances might be completely different as well. Now, my feeling is, I've always had this feeling that we've got absolutely nothing to fear from China at all. We've got nothing to fear from China at all. And I'd actually be more fearful about the United States and where that's heading at the moment. But even still, national opinion and perceptions of China, not just in Australia but globally, might be totally different in 20, 30 years' time. And we have to remember that great fear that the Western world had of all things German and Japanese just after the Second World War, 20, 30 years later, it was totally different. Germany became a highly respected player on the world scene, and Japan did become our biggest trading partner. It's still our number 2 trading partner at the moment. And we also had a more conventional submarine deal with France that offered far greater certainty, and that was the one that was set up in 2017 under the Turnbull government. And under that deal, Australia was going to be getting its first submarine in 2032. Now, that's just 6 years away, and I realised the time frame was going to stretch out a bit, and the $90 billion budget was probably going to be increased as well. But even still, that sort of level of certainty has been replaced with this dog of an AUKUS project. That certainty that we might have had before, it's been replaced with this incredibly massive gamble on national security, and that it's also putting a lot of faith in other countries and taking a lot of control out of Australia's hands.
One of the things that you can rely on is that you cannot rely on other countries. Each country will act in its own self-interest first, which is only the right thing to do. Like, what country is going to say to its citizens, except maybe Australia, we are going to bring in this policy that makes you materially worse off, makes your defence worse off, makes your place in the world a bit worse off. AUKUS has the potential to ruin our trading relationships with other countries. Maybe not China. If I was Indonesia, I might be worried. Now, I will be fair here. Unlike the American, where they took out all their geniuses, and there were geniuses in the American Foreign Office, the Department of State, Trump got rid of most of them. Australia still has some very, very good diplomatic staff. So we might be able to assuage Indonesia, not have China worry too much, and keep our friendship with America. But to me, that would be radically reforming AUKUS into something that works in the Australian national interest rather than works in the interests of those who think that the sun never sets on the British Empire and American John Wayne and Clint Eastwood are coming in to save us all, and Batman and Superman and Spider-Man, you know.
Well, I feel much better now that you've mentioned all of those characters.
And it was certainly this Scott Morrison idea that evangelical or Pentecostal Christianity will save the world. And that is expressed through the white man. And I use both terms, white and man, as with as much cynicism, but also as much weight as I can give them, because that's where Morrison came out of. We expected better from the Albanese government, and this has been a bit of a theme of our podcast, that the Albanese government mightn't be the worst government Australia's ever had, and I know that there are people who think that the Albanese government is the worst government, mostly, but not all Facebook bots. I do know that the stronger position is that it's been a disappointing government, and while it has done some good things, it hasn't balanced that out with the bad things.
This is New Politics, independent analysis of Australian and international politics. For more free articles and analysis, join us at newpolitics.com.au.
Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Richard Marles joins me now live from Darwin. Now, your government insists this is not a US base just outside of Perth, at Garden Island. But to everyday Australians, that many American troops arriving certainly sounds like one.
Well, it's a rotation. It's something that we've been talking about now since the beginning of 2023, so none of this is new. It'll be the Submarine Rotation Force West. We're spending about $8 billion on readying HMAS Stirling for the beginning of that, which will commence at the end of next year in December of 2027. But this is a really important step in the AUKUS program, in Australia acquiring a nuclear-powered submarine capability, and America operating from HMAS Stirling will be really important in terms of giving us the opportunity to get the skills to work on nuclear-powered submarines, to work in them. We actually have submariners working in them right now, and this is a critical step in terms of us being able to develop our own capability.
Most of the discussion has been about these submarines and the money that's involved, but to me, a lot of that is a bit of a red herring because AUKUS has become a lot more than just these submarines and also a lot more about the money, even though it's a lot of money, $368 billion. But maybe this is what the plan was all along, because no politician in Australia has actually had the courage to tell us what AUKUS is all about. And essentially, to me, the way that we've been able to look at it over the past 5 years is that essentially it's this new form of American imperialism as well, because from 2027, American nuclear-powered submarines are expected to rotate through HMAS Stirling, and that's Garden Island, just off the coast of Perth. But with these rotations to support all of this, Australia is building the infrastructure, all of the supporting logistics and the maintenance for what seems to be a substantial and long-enduring American military presence. And eventually, within the next 2 or 3 years, there'll be thousands of US personnel, there'll be contractors and dependents, families that will become a part of all of these operations. And I'm not sure what you can call this. Here's a military base. It's on Australian soil. That's HMAS Stirling at Garden Island. It's a military base on Australian soil, but you've got thousands of Americans working at the base. And I think you can probably call that a US base. But the bigger issue is what happens when Australia and America disagree over a particular military strategy or a campaign. So what if the US wants to use this infrastructure at Garden Island for a conflict with China over Taiwan that Australia doesn't support? And you referred to this before, David, because that would be a massive issue for the trade that we have with China, and that will affect our economy drastically. So Pine Gap is also used by the United States for all of these conflicts that the Australian public wouldn't support. There's not much that we know about within Pine Gap anyway, but what if the government stops supporting all of this? Can they genuinely say no? And I would say that they probably won't. So that's one issue. But if US military operations are conducted from Australian territory, does that infrastructure then become a target in a war with someone else? And it's not such a far-fetched idea, because Iran was attacking US bases that was stationed in the Gulf states recently, so it's not as ridiculous as people might think.
No, it is a worry. Australia has been attacked before. Darwin was bombed during World War II, and Sydney was shelled, and Brisbane was shelled. But that was during a war in which we were an active participant. Now, I'm not saying that was a good thing or that it was even a right thing, but it was a thing. And no, it's not fair to have Australian land bombed or invaded because some other power has stuff there. Collateral damage is a big thing. All it takes is one wrong number punched into a drone and it's a school or a hospital, not the base they were after. And it's quite possible that you have a very hostile nation that wants to punish Australia anyway and will bomb not just the American base, but Australian infrastructure to teach a lesson. Now, I'm not saying who that might be, but there's enough anger in the world about the US that it could come from anywhere. So again, yes, maintain our relationship with the states, but also maintain our relationship with everyone else and try and keep the states' own international politics that don't affect us out of it. Don't make it affect us by putting in these bases.
Anger is rising once again on the streets of Okinawa. Hundreds of protesters flooded the area outside the U.S. Marine Corps Camp Schwab in Nago on Saturday, pouring into the streets with a single defiant message: no more bases, no more war.
And also, if people want to see where all of this is heading, we're trying to provide as many examples as possible of where this could go wrong. I think they just need to look at the Okinawan Islands in Japan, where there's been a US military presence since the Second World War. So that's 80 years or so, and that's become deeply embedded, the US military presence over there. And for many decades, especially over the past maybe 20, 30 years, local communities in Okinawa have protested about the noise, the military accidents, the environmental contamination, the unauthorised use of land. Then there's all the crimes involving US personnel. I think the first batch of crimes, I think the series of rapes in the early or the mid-1950s or thereabouts. So that's been an ongoing issue within Okinawa as well. And the people of Okinawa, they would have a good reason to remove the Americans from their islands. And I think the Japanese government is supportive as well, yet substantially reducing that military presence has proved to be extraordinarily difficult. Now, sure, we can argue that Western Australia isn't Okinawa, but the principle is pretty much the same. Once billions are invested at HMAS Stirling, then local businesses then start depending on the defence contracts. American personnel settle around the Rockingham region in Perth, and reversing this process will almost become impossible. And sure, there might be some local jobs and investment, but there will also be a lot of pressure on housing. We've got a housing problem in Australia as well. There will be pressure on local schools, healthcare and infrastructure, alongside questions about nuclear safety and environmental risk. And at the moment, there are just absolutely no safeguards in place about all of this, and probably never will be. And by the time the Australian community's worked out what's going on here and we want to change all of this, it might just end up being too deeply embedded to unwind, as the people of Okinawa have found out.
With the housing, the Americans will build housing for their defence staff, which will have absolutely no impact on Australian housing at all. So, yeah, Okinawa is a great example. We could even look at the Philippines, let alone all those places in the Middle East which were just bombed. American defence expansion does help in some ways, but not in as many ways as you think. Yes, shops get a boost from extra people. You might even get, let's be fair, the building of communities, but expat communities like this tend to stay amongst themselves, if only because a lot of the work is extremely confidential and you don't want to make friends with too many locals in case you give away inadvertent secrets. It's easy just not to engage with people rather than risk breaking your own country's confidentiality laws or national security laws. So your benefits suddenly become a little bit less beneficial and a little bit more problematic. So, yeah, again, there's nothing in this deal. And the interesting thing, too, is that it was obvious, but there's nothing in this deal that advantages Australia at all, except maybe the protection of a fading superpower that Australia wouldn't need if it didn't get into bed so deeply with this superpower. So again, it was a dud deal. It was something that the Labor government should have gone straight in and said, we are renegotiating this to a much more favourable circumstance. If we can't, we'll get out of it. Morrison is spruiking it as his great legacy. Really? About it.
Well, he wouldn't really know if his pants are on fire, but this is becoming...
They constantly are.
Yeah. But I just think it's becoming more obvious as time goes on. But AUKUS is really it's part of a much bigger, largely silent transformation of the Australian defence system. And as I mentioned before, it's not submarines, the money involved, that's probably a side issue. And we just keep getting fed more and more political bullshit as time goes on. And this goes far beyond the submarines. We've got Pine Gap. There's US Marines in Darwin, more American access to Northern Australia, the integration of intelligence, joint planning, and an increasingly connected defence system with the United States. And it's all at the behest of the United States. Now, David, I'm not naive enough to think that we don't need any military systems in place at all. It just seems to be part of the human condition that each country needs to have some military deterrence in place. But I think the world generally, in Australia, should be working towards reducing the risks rather than increasing them, which is what this type of AUKUS arrangement will actually do, certainly for Australia. And the other big factor is that there's been virtually no democratic debate about any of this. There seems to be bipartisan support for AUKUS on the coalition and the Labor Party, and governments probably know that there's no public support for this, and there probably never will be, and that's why they're ramming this through on a bipartisan level without any public consent. It's also about the sort of relationship that we end up actually creating with the United States, which we've mentioned quite a few times today, which is essentially playing out its own end game. And the issue is that because the time that we find out exactly what the consequences are for Australia through AUKUS, I don't think any of this will be very good for Australia at all. And the people who have set up and facilitated all of this, Scott Morrison, Anthony Albanese, Richard Marles, Penny Wong, Pat Conroy, if you want to go down that path as well, well, they've either already left politics or will be long gone from politics by the time we find out the full ramifications and the consequences of AUKUS. And they'll just never be held responsible for this calamity or the colossal error that Malcolm Turnbull called it. And this will become the responsibility of many generations in the future.
Yeah. One of the things that politicians never seem to quite consider is what is their legacy. Now, of course, you can't fully control that. People will tell you what they think. In Australia, of course, we've got a very odd media. But then again, we will have historians who will correct or at least adjust the record based on the evidence that comes out that was available at the time, but also evidence that comes out subsequently, holding back the cabinet papers from 25 years, for example. And that's something is often enlightening as to what governments have done. Of course, sometimes things seem like a bad idea at the time and turn out to be a great idea. I don't think this is the case with AUKUS, because the AUKUS is clearly a dud proposition, negotiated by a dud Prime Minister, but held in with a government who continually shouldn't be as timid as they sometimes seem to be. And ultimately, we need to get out of this bad deal. I think legally we can. I think any international court would say, yes, this was a bad deal signed in bad faith. You have tried to honour it, but the expense of it is too much. I think a good lawyer would be able to get us out of the contract without the reputational damage Morrison did by just killing the French deal. That damaged Australia very badly in trade negotiations. What helped was Morrison being comprehensively kicked out of Parliament. But you then don't want to have the opposite one, that Australia will accept bad deals. We've just got to get through this. We've just got to get out of it. We've got to show some national interest and work in the national interest so that Australia becomes an independent sovereign nation. And then we can really start to talk about things like a republic, like an Indigenous voice to Parliament, or whatever the next good idea is. Till then, all of that is just tinkering around the edges. We've got to get the centre right first, or the centre correct first.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you value independent journalism without the influence of corporate backing, join New Politics at newpolitics.com.au and support us directly. It's just $5 per month, and we always try to keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.